So, okay, now we have some approaches that we can use to classify a behavior loosely as being abnormal or not. But let's move on now to how we would actually go about physically diagnosing it. So, like everything we've talked about in this class, we have to consider both biology and environment, nature and nurture, when we're talking about diagnoses, because psychological disorders can develop from a variety of factors and they all overlap. So this can arise from different genetics or brain abnormalities that could lead or make you susceptible to a given disorder. You might have different psychological factors. Maybe you have maladaptive behaviors. You're learning some negative association, or you're coping poorly, or you have some interpersonal problems. But then also environment plays a huge role too. Like we saw in those examples, maybe you have a death in the family that's a stressful life circumstance, or you have different, uh, cultural or social kind of differences. There's inequalities in financial status, education level. There's so much that can play into how one experiences their mental health. And again, it's always a combination of the things. It's never typically just one, they all overlap. So someone tried to model this to figure out how conditions could be diagnosed. So this is a model, a term that I would write down and know. It's diathesis stress model. So diathesis means something that is an underlying tendency or a predisposition for something, or a fancy word for nature. And then stress is that environmental factor. So this is a nature nurture model, basically. And it's saying that you have an internal predisposition. So maybe you have some disordered neurotransmitters, your biochemistry is a little bit off, or you have different brain regions that are abnormally active or inactive, etc. Genes might play a role. So you have some underlying biological factor that, if added to an environmental factor, some external trigger, like a death in the family, or I have like maybe some traumatic like fire or something that is just causing you an intense amount of stress, together could cross that line and lead you into a diagnosable disorder. So nature plus nurture could lead you to disorder if all of those things are present. Okay, so that's how disorders could arise. But now we come to the critical part that I feel like I've been just delaying this whole time. How do we actually diagnose, scientifically label disorders? But before we get into that, I'm going to ask you whether we should even do this. We're going to talk about this manual called the DSM-5, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is a mouthful. It's gone through 5 different editions now. The most recent came out in 2013, and this is kind of like the disorder Bible of what doctors and psychiatrists and whatnot use to figure out and diagnose disorders. Take a second and make a guess. How many disorders do you think exist here? 10, 20, 50? Turns out there are 157 disorders in the current DSM. I couldn't even name 150 disorders. So before I want to kind of delve deeper into the actual nitty-gritty of what goes into a diagnosis, why do we have so many labels? Do you think labeling 157 disorders is a good thing? Do you think having a name for a particular set of behaviors is something we should strive for, or strive against? That's a weird, should we lean against doing that? So I want you to think of some pros and cons of what having that label would be like.